The cook was already dead, not from a bullet, not from a shell, from a broken wagon axle, a frozen river, and 3 weeks without resupply. When the men found his body, they were not grieving. They were going through his pockets. They were looking for hardtack. That is where this story starts. Not in the officer's mess, with its silver and its port. Not in the regimental histories, with their talk of glory and discipline. It starts in the mud, with hungry men searching a dead man for food. What they found, and what they didn't, is the real story of how Britain fed its soldiers, and it is stranger, darker, and more disturbing than anything you have been told. You are a British private. It is 1811. You are somewhere in the Spanish interior. You don't know exactly where, because no one tells privates where they are. Well, you have been marching since before dawn. Your boots have not been dry in a week. Your pack weighs 60 pounds, and now it is dusk. The fires are lit, and you are waiting for dinner. What arrives is this: an iron camp kettle, 1 per 10 men. Into it goes the salt beef, gray, dense, preserved in brine so strong it would blister your tongue raw if you ate it unsoaked. Alongside it, fragments of hardtack biscuit, possibly a handful of dried peas, possibly nothing else at all. That stew, soldiers called it skilly, is what the British Empire asked its men to march 15 miles a day on. But the stew was not the worst part. The worst part was when it didn't come at all. The system responsible for feeding the army was called the commissariat, and calling it a system is generous. It was a chain of assumptions, each one held by a man who had never spent a night in the field, stretching from a London office all the way to the front line. When that chain broke, men starved. Picture the commissariat officer in 1811. He is sitting in a tent 3 miles behind the line. On his desk is a ledger showing that each man received 1 pound of biscuit, 1 pound of salt meat, and a gill of rum today. The ledger is correct. The food, somewhere between his desk and the forward position, has not arrived. He does not know this. He will not know this until someone dies of it. Wellington knew. His letters from the peninsula read less like military dispatches and more like a man slowly losing his mind. In one, he described watching soldiers fall out of the march column from weakness. Not wounds, not exhaustion, but hunger. In another, he wrote that his commissariat was the worst conducted department in the British service. He was not exaggerating. He was, if anything, being restrained. And then 40 years later, the world found out just how bad it truly was. The Crimea, 1854. The first war Britain fought in the age of the newspaper correspondent. For the first time in history, journalists were permitted into a theater of war. They wrote what they saw. And what they saw went into every drawing room in England. British soldiers besieging Sevastopol, dying, not from Russian guns, from scurvy, from cholera, from a ration that had collapsed so completely that men were receiving a quarter of their official allowance on good days and nothing on bad ones. Fresh vegetables had not been seen in months. The salt meat arriving in camp was frequently black, header filmed with mold, radiating a smell that soldiers described as the stench of the hold. Scurvy. In 1854. 70 years after the Royal Navy had solved it with lemon juice. The Army had simply never applied the lesson. Your gums are bleeding. You notice it first when you bite the hardtack. A faint iron taste. A sting where your teeth meet the biscuit. You do not yet know what this means. In another 2 weeks, your teeth will begin to loosen. In 6 weeks, without intervention, you will be unable to walk. You are not being shot at. You are not being gassed. You are dying of a vitamin deficiency that a glass of lemon juice a day would prevent entirely. The Army has lemon juice. It is sitting in a warehouse in Balaclava, 3 miles away, awaiting a paperwork authorization that has not yet been signed. 40% of British deaths in the Crimea were from disease, not combat. And the scandal that followed forced the Army to face something it had been refusing to face for a century. It did not know how to cook, not institutionally, not in any taught, measured, replicable way. Soldiers had always been expected to cook for themselves. In groups, over open fires, with no training and equipment that would embarrass a Victorian scullery maid. The assumption was that any man could boil water. It was wrong. Boiling water inadequately kills some bacteria. Boiling it correctly kills the ones that were killing the Army. The difference in a field context without instruction is not obvious. The difference in a Crimean ditch in December 1854 was the difference between life and death. It is 1870. You are sitting in a bare room at Aldershot. Otter, you are one of the first soldiers to attend the British Army's newly opened School of Cookery. The instructor, a blunt sergeant with strong opinions about fat temperatures, is showing you how to properly render lard before frying. You have been eating Army food for 4 years. It has never once been prepared this way. You taste what he has cooked. Something shifts in you that you cannot name. It took the Crimean disaster, thousands of dead men, a public scandal, parliamentary inquiries, to produce this moment. One room, one instructor. Soldiers learning that food could be made edible. It was progress. Slow, painful, late progress. And it was about to meet the Western Front. France, 1916. The mud is not metaphorical. The trenches of the Somme were not trenches in any architectural sense. They were collapsed walls of wet earth, held up by timber and wishful thinking, flooded knee-deep for weeks at a time, cut through with communication routes so narrow and exposed that moving through them at anything other than a crouch invited a sniper's attention. Hot food was delivered by ration parties. 2 or 4 men, carrying containers, moving at night, stopping flat against the trench wall every time a shell landed close enough to rattle their teeth. By the time food arrived at the forward line, it had been carried 1.5 miles through the dark. It was cold. It was frequently spilled. On heavy shelling nights, it did not come at all. You are in a forward trench outside Arras. November. It has rained for 11 days without stopping. Your feet have not been dry since October. The ration party was due 2 hours ago. You stopped being angry about it an hour ago. Now you are simply waiting in the particular blank way that men wait when they have been waiting long enough that hoping feels like a waste of energy. Eventually, someone passes you a tin of bully beef, cold, straight from the tin. You eat it with a biscuit. You do not taste it. You are aware only of its temperature, which is the same as the air, which is the same as the mud, which is the same as everything around you. But it was not the cold food that broke men. It was something smaller, quieter, and more devastating than that. There is a letter in the Imperial War Museum, a private in the Lancashire Fusiliers, writing home in November 1916. He spends 4 paragraphs, 4 entire paragraphs, describing a single meal. Fried bacon, fried bread, cooked on a brazier in a dugout outside Arras. He describes the sound of the fat hitting the iron, the way the bread crisped at the edges, the warmth spreading through his chest when he swallowed. He writes, "I have not tasted anything so good in my life." He was 22 years old. He had spent 3 months eating cold bully beef from a tin in the rain, fried bread. That was the greatest meal of his life. Read that again. A 22-year-old man writing to his mother, using 1/3 of his letter, paper he carried in a waterproof pouch, ink he rationed carefully, to describe fried bread. Not because he is a poor writer, because nothing in his recent life has come close to the emotional weight of that meal. Because after months of eating food that tasted of nothing, of eating mechanically in the dark because the body demands it, regardless of what the mind feels, something hot and slightly charred and smelling of fat was not just food, it was proof. Proof that warmth existed, that pleasure existed, that somewhere inside the machinery of war, a small human moment had survived. The Second World War tried to make sure men never had to write letters like that again. It partially succeeded, but the way it tried reveals exactly what had been missing all along. The composite ration, introduced in 1942, was built on a new idea. Simple, obvious in retrospect, never formally articulated before. A soldier operating where cooking is impossible still needs a complete diet. Tinned meat, biscuits, oatmeal, tea, chocolate, boiled sweets. Everything a man needed for 24 hours in a box he could carry in his pack. It worked, nutritionally. What it could not solve was something the Army had not anticipated, that men who ate the same box day after day, week after week, stopped wanting to eat. The appetite shut down, not from illness, from monotony so complete it felt like grief. And men who stopped eating stopped functioning. Slower reactions, poor decisions, the kind of subtle degradation that does not show up in casualty reports but absolutely shows up in battles. The Army studied this. Then it did something it had never formally done before. It mandated hot food. not as a reward for favorable conditions, not as a nice-to-have when logistics permitted, as a requirement, a command obligation, as binding as ammunition supply. A soldier would receive a hot meal. Full stop. It took 130 years, from the peninsula to the western desert, 130 years to formally decide that a soldier deserves something warm to eat. Here is what 3 centuries of British military feeding history actually tells us. It is not a story about incompetence, though there was incompetence. It is not a story about cruelty, though there was cruelty. It is a story about what a society decides its soldiers are worth. And the answer, for most of British history, was less than the paperwork suggested. You are reading this from somewhere warm. You are not being shot at. Food is within minutes of you right now. You could have it in your hands before the sentence ends. Hold that. Hold it against the image of a 22-year-old in a Flanders dugout spending a third of his letter home on fried bread. Hold it against the man outside Sevastopol whose gums are bleeding because a form hasn't been signed. Hold it against the private in Spain eating gray stew from a shared tin in the dark, not knowing where he is, not knowing what tomorrow brings, knowing only that the fire is warm and the man beside him is eating too. And for now, that is enough. Armies do not run on courage. They run on this, on the pot in the mud, the fire in the trench, the tin passed between 2 men who do not need to speak because the act of eating together says everything that needs to be said. The battles are in the history books. The meals are in the letters. And the letters are where the truth lives. Start there. Everything else follows.